Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I move to suspend the Senate's regular order of business to take up and consider at this time Senate Bill 2, the bill we passed on second reading yesterday. It restores the law to what it was before 2021 to adjust for an amendment that was added to a bill late in the process, and also to correct a court opinion. That's what the bill does, and I move suspension.
Senator West, for what purpose?
Question of the author.
Senator Hughes, do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Members. Senator Hughes, yesterday during the lengthy discussion, we were talking about provisional balloting. And what is the status if someone does a provisional ballot? Are they subject to this particular law, prosecution under this law?
Well, thank you, Senator. This is worth discussing because I want to make sure I'm sticking to the language of the bill. I think I can answer your question. Now, the current statute, 64.012, illegal voting, basically, I'll just read exactly what it says. Subsection C says, a person may not be convicted solely upon the fact that the person signed a provisional ballot affidavit under section 63.011 unless corroborated by other evidence that the person knowingly committed the offense. Now, that's the quote from the current statute. Senate Bill 2 does not amend that language at all, as you know. So that's what we're talking about on provisional ballot.
So a person can be prosecuted if there's a provisional ballot and there's corroborating evidence of the commission of another offense, to wit, the offense subject to this particular section. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. And that's the law today and also after Senate Bill 2, should it pass. I believe that's correct.
All right,
I think you're reading that right.
So if there was any misunderstanding yesterday that a person submitting a provisional ballot affidavit could not be prosecuted in this section, this clears up this clears that up, right?
I believe so. The signing of that affidavit in and of itself, because as you know, when you sign the affidavit, you're swearing that I'm eligible to vote in this location. I'm not been convicted of a felony, or if I have, I've completed my terms and haven't been found incompetent, had my voting rights taken away. So when someone signs that provisional ballot application, they are swearing to that. And this section of the code, added last session, says that act in and of itself, by itself, is not enough. There has to be corroborating evidence.
Of another offense?
Well, of the offense of anything in this list of illegal voting. Yes, sir.
All right, so then a person could, theoretically, if a prosecutor decided, your language becomes law, they could be prosecuted even if they executed a provisional ballot affidavit. They could be prosecuted under this particular law if a prosecutor decided that there were facts substantial enough to bring
I believe that if there's, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, if a prosecutor believed that there was probable cause to bring a case.
There was corroborating, if it was corroborated by other evidence that they knowingly committed the offense. Yes, sir. I believe you're reading that right. That's correct.
Okay, so, all right. So I just want to make sure we cleared that up, because yesterday I thought you had said that if a person did a provisional ballot that they would not be prosecuted under the statute. That's not correct.
No.
Let me finish. If indeed a prosecutor thought there was probable cause that under the new statute that they had committed an offense, they could be prosecuted even if they had just executed a provisional ballot, correct?
Senator, that's exactly right. And I want to make sure I'm sticking to the language of the statute. You are correct. You're reading it correctly.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Menendez, for a purpose?
Mr. President, will the gentleman yield for a question?
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thank you. Senator Hughes, yesterday, and I think just a few minutes ago, you stated that this was, you were simply trying to rectify a mistake that was caused last session. And if I understand correctly, now this is where I'd like clarification. In the second special session on Senate Bill 1, an amendment was added that reduced the penalty by Representative Steve Allison, a Republican from Bexar County. Is that not correct?
I believe that's correct. And if I don't think I used the word mistake a moment ago, but it was, the amendment was added late in the process. And I don't know what the state of mind was, but yes, it was an amendment added in the House at the very end. And I believe Representative Allison offered the amendment.
Yes,
I believe that's right.
Amendment was added late in the House, but didn't that amendment cause the bill, Senate Bill 1, to go to conference?
No, sir, the bill was going to conference already because because the Senate wanted to remove another amendment that had been added, and so the bill was already on its way to conference.
So you just stated that the bill was going to conference so that you could remove another amendment, correct? So at conference, wouldn't you have been able to remove this amendment, the one that reduced the penalty?
Well, Senator, if you review the debate on this amendment we're discussing now, it was the substance of a bill that had been offered during the regular session and during the special session. But for some reason in the second special session with this amendment, the bill itself language was amended to include this lowered offense. That was not discussed when the amendment was laid out, was not discussed when the author of the bill, Representative Murr, accepted the amendment.
So the amendment's accepted, but the bill still goes to conference, correct?
That's correct.
So the bill goes to conference, and just for the purposes of people not familiar with the process, at that moment, there are 5 conferees. Were you the chair of that conference committee on the Senate side?
I believe I was the chair on the Senate side. I believe that's right.
So then you and the other 4 conferees have the capacity in conference committee to strip any amendment that you want, don't you?
Well, we can on the Senate side. We cannot force the House to comply. As you'll recall, Senate Bill 1 had been the source of quite a bit of attention. Some of our friends in the House left the state, causing another special session. And so it was delicate. And by the time the language buried in this amendment was discovered, it was real late in the process. There was a lot in Senate Bill 1 that the Senate agreed with, that the House agreed with. So the decision was made to move the bill, knowing we could come back and address this amendment. And as you may recall, the Senate, in the next special session, passed a bill to remove this amendment. So this is not the first time the Senate has addressed this.
But nevertheless, the capacity was there for you to request this amendment to be removed at conference, but it was not removed at conference, correct?
I wish the amendment had been caught earlier in the process, and that's why we're here now, because as you know, we meet every 2 years or more often sometimes to continue and clean up and make improvements and learn from experience. So that's what we're doing today.
Thank you for taking my questions.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Gutierrez, what purpose?
No, just for a couple questions.
Do you yield?
I'll yield.
Senator Hughes, thank you, Mr. President, first off. Senator Hughes, we had an at-length discussion. I don't want to delay things any further. Just want to reiterate one thing. Since the last election, in your county, in Mineola, or any other county, was there any illegal voting that led to any kind of indictments, or rather informations filed, because it would be a misdemeanor? Any informations filed across this state that you know of?
I believe there are investigations taking place, but I don't know if anything's been filed. If you know, let me know. I don't know the answer.
No, I don't know. I don't know any. As a matter of fact, I think it's 0. So no.
Now, do you think it's 0 or you don't know? Because those are different things.
Yeah, I think it's 0.
You think or you know it's 0? Since we're talking to the Senate, we should be careful in the information we share. Make sure it's accurate.
For sure. But you and I read the paper, and I haven't heard of any such thing, right? And so here we are. And this is a burning issue to you to change this from a misdemeanor back to a felony.
Like it was for 50 years almost.
Absolutely. But times change, and legislatures make changes when things need to be changed. And indeed, Representative Allison, this was part of a deal. I don't need to rehash what Senator Menendez has suggested, but you were on the conference committee. There's just a handful of people. And yesterday, you kind of made it seem like this was something that just kind of got through there surreptitiously, that caught us all unaware. But this was debated in that second special session.
No, sir, it was not.
Talked about.
No, sir, it was
not in this room, but in the conference committee. You talked amongst yourselves. You have a green document that you all signed. You did read it, right?
I read it pretty carefully.
Why did you sign off on it?
Senator, as I mentioned before, by the time this amendment was discovered in the House and the Senate, the process was so far along, and there was so much work in Senate Bill 1 that everybody on this floor and on that floor worked on. The decision was made to pass the bill and get the good policies in place and come back and to address this. And as you know, as you may recall, we were here in the next special session, and the Senate passed a bill correcting this amendment from Senate Bill 1 that we're discussing today. The Senate passed that, the House did not, so now we're back.
But to your
number, and I would say this, Senator, it might help you to know, a number of members of the House have filed bills to do this very thing, to restore that penalty to the felony. It had been a felony for almost 50 years.
Yeah. But again, and lastly, to your knowledge, no undocumented immigrants voted illegally, or let me change the question and make it so simplified. There were no informations to your knowledge that were filed for undocumented immigrants illegally voting. That was one of the fact patterns you put up.
Well, the question was asked about illegal voting and whether non-citizens had the right to vote. I was responding to questions. I don't think there's a dispute about whether only citizens get to vote. Do we agree on that?
My question to you is very simple.
Do we agree on that, Senator?
My question to you is very simple. Are you aware of any informations that were filed by undocumented immigrants for illegally voting in the last election?
I know there are investigations ongoing. I don't know about the state of any prosecutions.
Okay, and we can talk offline about those investigations because I haven't heard of any. Are you aware of any informations that were filed for felons that, because that was your other fact pattern, that voted in the last election cycle?
Now, Senator, they weren't my fact patterns. I responded to questions from senators, and they gave me fact patterns, and I responded like I'm trying to do here. I know there are investigations going on. I'm not aware of the status of any prosecutions. If you know something, let me know.
These weren't fact patterns from other people. You put out 3 scenarios. You said if you voted in another state, if you were a felon and you couldn't vote, or if you're not a citizen of this country. Those not anybody's fact patterns, but I don't need to be argumentative.
It's the law, Senator. That's the law on illegal voting.
Absolutely. Are you aware from this last election cycle of any felons, any information's filed for any felons illegally voting in the last election? Are you aware of any?
I know investigations are ongoing. I'm not familiar with the status of any particular criminal prosecutions. And if you have any, let me know. I don't know.
None that I know of. How about out-of-state people that voted in another state, came to Texas and voted? Winter Texans, I don't know. You name it. Are you aware of any informations that from the last election across this state? And that's my last question.
I don't know about the status of prosecutions. There's a big discussion about folks being registered in multiple states and voting in multiple states. There's going to be some other legislation about this. Many states are looking at that issue, but I'm not sure about the status of any prosecutions today.
You're not aware of any. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Gutierrez. Senator Betancourt, what purpose?
Ask questions of the author.
Do you yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
Thanks, Senator Hughes, for bringing this bill and for the explanations. There is a major investigation underway in Harris County.
I've read about that.
Where both the governor and also the district attorney, people of both political parties, have asked the Texas Rangers to come down and investigate what happened on November 8th, 2022, due to the fact that the election process, quite frankly, nearly broke down. And we have, by reports from one news source, KHOU 11, it identified 121 polls that had paper ballots that weren't delivered in a timely fashion or at all. And you wonder if the election administrator either couldn't or wouldn't get that paper ballots out. But the point I'm making here is there are now 21 active election challenges in Harris County. And they are literally going to be bringing, people in to discuss voting because clearly the people that were turned away from the polls, that's voter suppression, plain and simple. When government puts on an election and doesn't have ballot paper for everybody to vote, it is voter suppression. So there's going to be literally hundreds of people discussed and deposed, I assume, in these, and we don't know where these investigations are going to lead to. As somebody that used to be a voter registrar, and we'd have to fill out, the documents by state law about allegedly voted twice, these are complex investigations because many times, government makes an error. Well, at a minimum, Government made the most preposterous error I've ever seen in my life for the nation's third largest county to have a third world election, which is put on election and leave millions of sheets of ballot sheets in the warehouse and not bring it to the polls. So we don't know what we're dealing, but we have active Texas Ranger investigations requested by a Democrat DA and a Republican governor, and we don't know where that's going to lead. But I wanted to make sure that part of this discussion is talking about a recognition of the obvious. When you have a chaotic election, anything can happen, and we just don't know what's going to happen until those 21 election contests are reviewed. Did you agree with that?
That's important, Senator. Thank you for pointing that out. We get a lot of questions about that because there were so many irregularities and so many questions that were asked.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Miles, what purpose?
To Senator Betancourt and then to the author.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not in order for you to question another senator on the floor, only the bill author.
Okay, then I'll just go to the author.
Do you yield?
Yes, of course I'll yield. Yes, sir.
Senator Betancourt's story that he just told you is absolutely correct. There is a major investigation in Harris County. It has to do with ballots not being delivered to the clerk's office on time, more so than, I don't know of any claims whatsoever of people voting twice. I don't know of any claims in the investigation that he's talking about of anybody voting who was not supposed to vote. The investigation is purely on why ballots didn't get to the clerk at the end of the voting period, and they got there later. And it's a tragedy, Senator Betancourt. But if we're going to tell the story, let's tell the story exactly how it is. There's no claims of fraudulent people of the one person voting twice. There's no claims of a person who is not qualified to vote voting. It's simply about the delivery of ballots. So let's make that clear. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hughes? Motion to move on suspension. Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores, Gutierrez, Hall, Hancock, Hinojosa, Huffman, Hughes, Johnson, King, Colcourse, Lamantia, Menendez, Middleton, Miles, Nichols, Parker, Paxton, Perry, Schwertner, Sparks, Springer, West, Whitmire, and Zaffarini.
The vote is 19-12 in favor. The rules are suspended. Chair now lays out on third reading and final passage Senate Bill 2. Secretary will read the caption.
Senate Bill 2 relating to conduct constituting the criminal offense of illegal voting.
You're recognized on final passage.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, thank you for your time yesterday and today. Senate Bill 2 does two things. It restores the penalty for illegal voting to a felony. It's been a felony for almost 50 years, goes back to 1975. The second part of this bill restores what Texas courts had held for over 100 years, that knowledge of the facts that make me unqualified to vote are sufficient. If I know I'm not a citizen, if I know I'm a felon not completed my terms and I vote, that is sufficient. That's been the law in Texas from the Court of Criminal Appeals, from multiple courts of appeals for 100 years. That was recently called into question by a ruling. Senate Bill 2 restores the law on those 2 points. That's what it does. That's all it does. It makes sense. I thank you for your support, and I move final passage.
Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Betancourt, Birdwell, Blanco, Campbell, Creighton, Eckhart, Flores.
There being 19 ayes and 12 nays, the bill is finally passed. Thank you, Senator Hughes.
Thank you, members.